Beautiful. So the Green Book Fair is something that we piloted last year. So it's something under something called the Non-Fiction Alliance, which is a radical collective of just under 30 independent publishers in the north of England. And the pilot last year was very much focused on what we could be doing to sell rights internationally as independent publishers without having that carbon heavy impact on the climate, and how we can connect with people in a way which perhaps doesn't mean that we have to travel to London and Bologna and Frankfurt. And, you know, the travel can be exhausting, but of course there are ways that we can work together in publishing, which can happen online. And COVID showed us that. We didn't all enjoy it, but we did know that we could, when forced, connect in a meaningful way. And so this year for the Green Book Fair, we scheduled multiple panels, because what we realized last year was that people really valued the skills learning, they valued connection, and that led to the right selling for us. So very much marketed on independent publishing and sort of diverse, perhaps literary fiction. And really, this is sort of a place throughout the 2 days, today and tomorrow, for you to explore what is out there, you know, internationally, what's going on. And I will pop in the chat so that you can sign up to all the events if you don't know quite what's going on. And we have events all throughout the day. You can pop in and out on various Zoom links as suits you. So I will pop that in there and you can have a little look. The next one will be at 10. So probably just before this Zoom link ends, I'll share that one with you in case registration has closed and you were interested. That one's with literary agents about international reach for authors. So we will kick off our keynote today. Something which is obviously very close to our hearts with the Green Book Fair is sustainability, but it is not, as we have titled the talk, very sexy to talk about. So I was really interested to find John Pabon's work, and I really wanted him to come talk to us. So today he's going to give us a little bit of information about how perhaps embracing eco-friendly practices can revolutionize our publishing strategy, boost our bottom line, that would be nice, wouldn't it? And captivate some environmentally conscious readers, from sustainable sourcing to energy efficient printing, and I'm sure lots more that I haven't thought was possible and I'm excited to learn about. So John Pabon has spent 2 decades in the business of saving our Earth. After leaving his role at the United Nations, John traveled the world studying the impacts of sustainability firsthand in factories, on fields, and in Fortune 500s. So very diverse experience. And he's an expert in sustainability with a mission to move sustainability from theory to practical strategies that really help people and businesses confidentially to make real impact. And to get there, he shares his message through books, consulting to businesses, and keynote speaking to audiences all around the world. And he's also the chair of the Conference Board's Asia Sustainability Leaders Council. He advises the United Nations, and he serves on the board of advisors to the US Green Chamber of Commerce. And he's the author of a book which looks super interesting, and I have on my to-read list already. It's called Sustainability for the Rest of Us, your no bullshit 5-point plan for saving the planet. And also, if you're going to get all John's books, which, you know, we're approaching Christmas period, we might have time to read them all. He has a book called The Greenwashing: How Brands, Governments, and Influencers Are Lying to You, which seems to be more and more the case, unfortunately. So I will hand over to John, and I believe there'll be space for questions at the end. So if you have anything you want to ask John, you would be very welcome to.
Excellent. Thanks so much. And thank you very much for the invite. Good morning, everybody. You are hearing an American accent, but I am dialing in from Melbourne, Australia. So it's evening on my side of the world. We're talking making sustainability sexy in the publishing industry, and definitely encourage everybody as we go through the presentation to mark down any questions, comments, or things you want to talk about, because don't worry, I have not created an hour-long keynote. There will be plenty of time for Q&A. But before we get into any of that, I want to introduce you to somebody. I want to introduce you to this guy. This is Tony Piliceno. Now, Tony, he had a passion for paint. Follow along with me. He channeled that passion into a job with one of America's oldest and largest paint companies, Sherwin-Williams, and he also took that passion onto TikTok, where he amassed millions of followers to his viral paint mixing challenge videos. Some of you, if you're on TikTok, you may know what I'm talking about. During the pandemic, it was a series of videos where there would be a can of white primer paint, 3 spigots, they would dump some color into it, mix it up, and viewers would guess what color would come out viral sensation for people locked in their homes during the pandemic.
Oh.
Sherwin-Williams management, they didn't think the same way because they said Tony violated their very outdated social media policy. Obviously, had they looked at this a lot more strategically, they would have realized that the consumers were demanding information and engagement from a different channel. Don't worry though, Tony landed on his feet. He got a job at Sherwin-Williams' biggest competitor, and they are doing great. Now, to me, Tony's story is very reminiscent of today's publishing industry. On one side, you have the Sherwin-Williamses of the world, old, traditional, slow, conservative. And then on the other side, you have the Tonys, fresh, nimble, and willing to take a risk. Those of us trying to communicate sustainability, sustainable impact, climate change, building a better world, we need more Tonys, which is why I'm really happy I got the invitation to do a keynote and to open up the conference today, because I'm excited to talk to all of you because I know that all of you are Tonys. So I'm really excited to share a little bit about my experience and certainly why we need more Tonys. To get there, I want to talk through a few different things. First, I want to give a shared definition of sustainability and clarify some of the big misconceptions we have when it comes to the space. Next, I want to go through some key success factors in communicating a sustainability message, and I'll explain why we're doing this when we get to that section. And then, of course, the part why you're all here, how publishing can become a sustainability champion. Now, to begin, I want to make sure that we're all on the same page when it comes to defining sustainability, because if I ask 5 people to define it, I'm going to get 100 different answers. So if you think sustainability is just about hugging the trees and saving the polar bears, think again, because the entire concept has evolved. Sustainability today really is an umbrella term for anything related to saving the planet, people, or wildlife and biodiversity. That could involve the environmental side of things, which of course gets the lion's share of the PR, but it also involves social elements, which includes labor rights, human rights, animal welfare, community engagement. There's an entire section that deals with what we call governance. It's kind of the nerdy side of sustainability, which is where I work. And that involves basically how we keep governments and corporations honest and making sure they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. That also includes, most relevant to all of you, the communications of sustainability. Now, you might be wondering, okay, why would I even waste time talking about a term that most of us think we know? Well, to demonstrate why having shared understandings is so important, I want you to think about Titanic. We know today the story of Titanic. We've seen the movie, we've read the books. We know that on an April night, a little over 100 years ago, 2,000 people lost their lives in a series of really unfortunate but largely preventable circumstances. What we don't often hear about is what was going on around Titanic that night. So, to be clear, Titanic was not the only ocean liner on the water that night. They were in communication with lots of different ships. So, why did only one, Carpathia, come to her rescue? And the answer to that, interestingly enough, this is good cocktail party fodder, Morse code. So the series of dots and dashes that we now attribute to international shipping played a pivotal role in sealing the fate of thousands that night. You see, a few years before Titanic set sail, international shipping adopted the convention SOS as the signal for distress on the high seas. But Titanic was a British ship, so they were using the outdated Marconi code CQD. When they messaged this out to other ships, the other ships thought it was a mistake and ignored her. Why a tandem onto a century-old event? Well, because in the modern-day struggle to save our own ship, planet Earth, we're making a lot of the same mistakes. We think we have a shared destination, but the way we're getting there is vastly different. If we want to make meaningful, impactful change, we have to have a shared understanding of things. Back when all of this began, a period I call Sustainability 1.0, there was much more of a shared approach. Rachel Carson's 1962 bestseller, Silent Spring, is usually heralded as kind of the start of the modern environmental movement. She talked about the impacts of pesticides, DDT, on the environment. There were the creation of organizations that are still in effect today, like the UN Environment Program, and a lot of the organizations like the World Wildlife Fund that are still in existence. Hell, even politicians, if you can believe it, were on board. One of my favorite sustainability fun facts is that the very first Earth Day, April 20th, 1972, was actually founded by a group of American senators, if you could believe it, including future Secretary of State John Kerry. Can you imagine politicians anywhere in the world today doing the same thing? So it was a vastly different world in sustainability 1.0. You fast forward to today, and we're seeing the next evolution of sustainability, what I call the gridization of good. Now, there's mounting pressure for the public to hold companies, individuals, even NGOs really accountable for their actions. And you can't deny the impact of sustainability ambassadors like Greta Thunberg and Extinction Rebellion at bringing sustainability kind of front and center in public attention. But there are waves of major global issues that threaten to dull their message and put sustainability on the back burner. One of the biggest is the major shift in geopolitics. I mean, we're seeing this play out literally in real time over the past week, particularly the rise of the post-truth world. And whether it's, I don't know, the war in Ukraine, getting the COVID vaccine, or the reality of climate change, a lot of people have become very extreme in their viewpoints. Ipsos data guru Bobby Duffy, he wrote an amazing book called The Perils of Perception, and he posits that this tribalism really has led to what he calls, quote, a fracturing of a shared sense of what the world is really like. And that fracturing, coupled with vast amounts of misinformation on the internet and in major news sources, and yes, in books too, has created an army of people stuck in their echo chambers. In other words, in the post-truth world, civil debate has become civil war. But don't worry. I'm a positivist, even though this might all sound quite negative. There is absolutely hope. And I want to share a few statistics. This is just from Australia, because obviously that's where I am, in terms of where the consumer mindset is. And this consumer mindset, you're all very literate people. You can read these. I'm not going to read them verbatim to you. But the consumer mindset is very representative of what people are looking for when it comes to the information they consume and the books they read as well. I think one of the most startling statistics on here is that 90% of Australian consumers are more likely to purchase ethical and sustainable products. That's amazing. And this is exactly what we've been working towards for the past 60 plus years. So I'm glad that we finally made it. Now, understanding just how broad sustainability is will hopefully help to open up many more opportunities in your minds around what really justifies sustainability and identifying authors and their stories. But I don't need to tell all of you that not all storytellers or stories are created equal. Now, over my 20 years in this field, the one constant barrier to implementing impactful, meaningful change has always been poor communications. I would have loved to have been in the room when whatever marketing genius thought up sustainability communications. And you know what I'm talking about. It's the burnt out hellscape of an Earth. It's the Mad Max future. It's the sad polar bear on the melting ice cap. Now, honestly, all these messages do is sort of create apathy. If I'm one of 10 billion people in this world and I see these messages, what can I do as an individual to actually elicit meaningful change? But when done right, messages can inspire and create that meaningful change. The key, though, is to understand what works and what doesn't. So first, what doesn't work? What's out? Shock and awe, doom and gloom. People don't want it. The activist organization Just Stop Oil, they've made quite a literal splash, with some of their antics around the world. This is a picture of them after they threw tomato soup on Van Gogh's sunflowers. Now, and as some of you may also know, because I know they do a lot of things in the UK, especially around gluing their faces to pavement. So this is really probably front of mind for many of you. Now, if the goal was to drive, and I'm going to use marketing terms here, if the goal was to drive impressions, eyeballs on this and raise awareness, it worked. But I truly believe that our goal today is no longer just to drive awareness, it's to convert people to do things, which is why I put such an emphasis on giving actionable things that people can do versus just raising awareness of a cause. Because if you look at something like this, all over social media, people were kind of scratching their heads going, I don't understand what the link is with sustainability and saving the world. And I sort of questioned that myself. But I'm not just picking on Just Stop Oil. They're one of many organizations that use sort of these shock and awe type tactics. The most notorious is PETA, the People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals. If anybody has ever seen their advertisements, they are quite gruesome and shocking. Is that working though? They've been doing this for 30 plus years. And interestingly enough, a study from the University of Queensland went into depth with this and essentially, long story short, found that when it comes to trying to promote or market ethical, good for the planet causes, these type of gruesome doom and gloom, shock and awe messages, they actually turn people off to doing anything at all. So, what are you supposed to be doing instead? What should you all, as publishing houses, be looking for instead? And I genuinely believe that effective sustainability communications comes down to one thing, and that's relatability. For too long, we've put anything related to saving the planet, climate change, sustainable development up on this pedestal. And yes, it's important, but it should not be out of reach. Scientists, they've shrouded practical understanding behind confusing formulas and metrics. Academics have locked actionable recommendations away in an ivory tower. Even sustainability consultants like myself, we are notorious for creating frameworks and models that only we know how to use. I want to see, and I guarantee that readers want to see as well something that they can relate to, understand, and learn from. If I think about my own writing style, I'm a very train of thought type of a writer. The last thing I would ever want to do is write an academic article or a scientific article because, well, first, it's kind of my personal definition of hell, but I sort of think, is anybody going to read this and is it going to have the impact I want it to have? My own writing, very casual. It's laced with profanity and slang, which gets me in trouble sometimes on Amazon. Sometimes I go off on tangents. I put anecdotes from TV or movies. I gossip a little bit as well. And people have said that that writing style to them is like having a conversation with a really good friend, and I couldn't think of higher praise. But my writing is also full of actionable things that people can do to affect meaningful change. Remember, the best authors in my space, they don't want to engage in an academic conversation. The time for that is sort of over. We want to empower people to be better. How an author does this can take many different forms. I think about some of the really fascinating authors on the forefront of cli-fi, climate fiction, like Genevieve Hilton. I think about investigative journalists like Amy Westervelt and people who were really bridging the divide between books and social media like Madeline Pendleton to get their stories across. The options really only end when the creativity of the author or the runway from the publishing house actually does. Now, you're probably scratching your heads thinking, well, John, that's great. But that's not really what I signed up for. What's all this have to do with me, and what am I supposed to do with all this information? And I'm glad you asked, because now we're going to get to the part that I'm sure most of you are dialing in for today. What can you do as independent publishers to really help champion our cause? Looking at the big picture, so panning out, your role is really, in my view, one of amplifying the voices that are trying to elicit this change. Given your very unique place in the publishing world, you're much better equipped to lead this change than some of the bigger and, again, more conservative types of houses. Doing so, though, is going to require some openness to stories and authors that might seem risky at first, but in reality are really reflective of what readers are dying to see. Practically, amplify our voice. Yeah, there's Greta. Practically, though, what impact is publishing having on the environment, and how can you then position your houses to be more of a leader in sustainability? I'm going to wow you with some stats, kind of the requirement of a keynote speech, right? So, when it comes to publishing, in the pulp and paper sector, book publishing is the third largest greenhouse gas emitter. Pretty shocking statistic. The industry in the US alone cuts down 32 million trees a year. About a third of these are killed for the production of books that people aren't even going to read. But tree felling, it only makes up about less than half of a book's environmental impact. The rest of that comes from the production process. And finally, globally, the production process itself emits more than 40 million metric tons of CO2 every year. That's on par with the annual emissions of Portugal. So a massive, massive impact on the environment coming from production. But what can you do to improve the numbers just a bit? And I want to think of this through the lens of three specific areas. The first is looking at your operations. So just because you might be smaller publishing houses doesn't mean you don't have an impact. Of course, you do. To start to pare that back, look at the carbon emissions you have from production, energy and water use, and the products like paper that you use, right? How can you be a little better with those? If we look at sustainability from the social elements of sustainability, do you have strong governance mechanisms in place to really govern what it is that you're doing? Is there gender parity in your house? Is there a massive gender pay gap that you should be shoring up? Or are you engaging in meaningful community type of activities that could also be beneficial in the social elements of sustainability? Next, examine your supply chain. The first port of call should always be a supplier's certifications. And not all certifications are created equal. There are some that are better than others. So, and I'll send these over to everybody as well afterwards, so you don't need to scribble furious notes. But look for chain of custody certifications from two organizations in particular, the Forest Stewardship Council and the Program for the Endorsement of Forest Certification, which I'm sure all of you are already doing. Look at what your printing partners are doing. Look at what their performance is like as well, including even down to the level of their gender pay gaps. Look at how environmentally friendly they are, or maybe they aren't, and also consider how to engage with the digital world in getting stories out there and sort of foregoing the printed book. Then finally, get collaborative. Collaboration is such an important and underutilized resource when it comes to building a better future. And there are lots of publishing industry groups that share knowledge around how to change for the better. Again, I'll send these out. Those include Publishing Declares, which is for some of you, I'm sure you are signatories to this. It's what would you call one of these? There's lots of them. It's a public signature that you would give from your publishing house to essentially say, yes, we are on track, or we are willing to become a sustainable publishing house. So great in terms of a declaration. There's the Book Journeys Project from the Independent Publishers Guild and BIC's Green Book Alliance. Those are just three examples of collaborative initiatives that your houses can certainly get involved in. But most importantly, if you remember nothing else from what I say, remember this. Take things step by step. Don't get overwhelmed by trying to do everything straight out of the gate. Identify what it is that you can have a truly material positive impact on first and focus on that. Don't try to do everything, because as the adage goes, if you try to do everything, you're probably going to accomplish nothing at all. We don't want you overexerting yourselves and getting burnt out, because at the end of the day, sustainability is a marathon, not a sprint. We've covered a lot. So we've talked about the history of sustainability. We've talked about definitions around sustainability. We've talked about effective communications and what your houses can do. Your heads are probably spinning right now, so I want to leave you with just three pieces of wisdom that kind of encapsulate everything that we've been talking about. The first is to think like a business person, not an activist. I cannot stress this enough. There's no reason you can't wear your heart on your sleeve, be altruistic, and think about this pragmatically and strategically at the same time. Second, and I did not make this up, I can't take credit for this, but I sort of live my life by this. You can do anything, but you can't do everything. You need to be selective with what areas are going to, like I said a second ago, have material positive impact on the planet versus trying to do everything and spreading yourself too thin, because at the end of the day, resources, time, sanity, these are all finite. And finally, don't forget, please be a Tony. Once you've identified the areas that you're addressing, which authors you want to work with, get stuck in. The world's waiting for champions like yourselves to help propel us all upwards. Thanks.
Cheers, John. Yeah, maybe leave the last slide up on the screen for a minute so people can follow you on various social medias and websites and things like that. Whilst people are thinking of questions, I wondered if you had an example of, you know, either a publishing business or an adjacent sort of sized business. When you were saying like about taking things, you know, step by step, don't be overwhelmed, you know, you can still think like a business. Do you have a good example of someone that did that with you, that you thought, you know, this really worked for them? That might be quite an open question, but you might have something in mind.
Sure, absolutely. So, and it's a recent example, a piece of work I'm working on right now with a major, totally different industry, medical indemnity company. So when they approached me about 6 or so months ago, they had a laundry list of things related to sustainability that they thought they had to accomplish. That included running a materiality assessment. I'm not going to bore you with what that is, but it's quite an in-depth process. Developing a full-scale reporting mechanism, going into carbon accounting for their business, looking at gender pay gap, literally a list of close to 30 different highly important things, but very in-depth pieces of work. And we worked together to sort of take them back off the ledge and say, hey, you don't have to do all this stuff right now. Nobody is begging you or forcing you to do this. So as a small business just starting out on your sustainability journey, let's focus on this one particular thing to do, and let's do that first. And they were very happy that I said that, because they didn't know how in the world they were going to accomplish all of these things that they thought they had to do all at once.
Yeah, I think a lot of small publishers will think, how do I find the time to, as willing as they want to be, to make their business, leaner in the sustainability way of thinking. So I guess if there was one thing that you wanted a publisher to look at today, one aspect, just say production, or yeah, I'll leave that open to you. But if you have one aspect that you say, you could start working on this part tomorrow, what would that be?
Yeah, so I think particularly for the publishing industry, the part that you should certainly be looking at and have a, hopefully in the not too distant future, if you don't already have a strong handle on, is what your suppliers are doing. I think that's where you can have the most material impact from a sustainability perspective, but also from just a business operations perspective, having transparency around what they're doing, how they're performing, the resources and products that they're using, and what their sort of performance is across all of that is going to benefit your business at the end of the day too. I have no qualms talking about the world of sustainability plus making money and being a profitable business. I think we do need to talk about those things in tandem more often. So those things should be working hand in glove as well. When the suppliers are better, when they're performing better, the business is more profitable. And hey, look, it's better for the planet as well.
Yeah, I mean, we had a talk recently from Clay's, which is, I think, the biggest UK book company for printing, and they have great eco values. But we were asking them about vegetable ink, and obviously you do have to pay more for that. So, it's one of these things that you want a world to all the books that are printed to survive on vegetable ink, and not have to, pay that extra that, probably bigger publishing companies are mostly going to be able to access. Because it was quite an add-on. I think off the top of my head, he said something like £2 per unit, which obviously would not be really feasible unless it was a hardback or something. So yeah, I feel like with things like that, you want the suppliers to be prioritizing it too, or state subsidies, these kind of things.
Absolutely right. And working with their expertise in what they do, and then you providing your expertise to them, and it's this give and take type of relationship where this is a really terrible phrase to use when we're talking about climate change, but raising the water level for everybody, so everybody improves over time.
Yeah, I think on a small scale. By the way, everyone, just pop questions in the chat if you've got any, or feel free to. I think you can raise your hand on Zoom and you can ask it on camera. But yeah, just on a small scale of that, of raising the water, or like making something a minimum. There's a brand of sellotape, for example, that's made out of plant starch. I always make a point of buying, even though it's small, because I just wish that sellotape would make everything from plant starch instead of the plastic. Because if they can do it, then why aren't they doing it? Why? I wish there was legislation that said if you can do something, don't do the planet's detrimental. Plan A, do plan B, because you can do that now. And then everyone across the board has to do it. But yes, I don't know how we quite get there, but it's good that these options are appearing and becoming more accessible in the high street, that I can go in and pick that up.
Absolutely. And some of these organizations I mentioned towards the end, the collaborative organizations, some of them are pushing for changes in legislation and regulation, because a lot of times movement doesn't happen in the business world unless the government mandates something. So there are things moving in that positive direction. So just stay tuned for when that finally does happen.
Cheers, John. If anyone has a question, just pop a little yes in the chat now. Otherwise, I'll tell you a little bit about our 10 a.m. Which you might like to join us for. We have two international agents who are literary agents for authors, who are telling us a little bit about how that works for them in terms of getting that author into other countries, translation, what the small market looks like. So I will pop the Zoom link for that in here if you've not already registered. There you go. One sec. Beautiful. Okay, well, I think everyone. Okay, we've got one question. Oh, here we go. We've got two now. I knew they would come in. Just didn't know when. Okay, so Ra from Comma, CEO of Comma Press in Manchester, says, do you think that the speaker thinks that new regulations being brought in from France will be adopted more widely by other governments? So maybe you want to talk a little bit about what those regulations are, John, for people that don't know as well.
I'm not sure which regulations they're referring to because France and
Like
the
they're
EU
about to come in.
in
There was like a
general.
bookseller article. And I feel I haven't read much into it as well because it's not quite been implemented yet. But I feel like, yeah, new paper sourcing regulations, I think it's going to affect everyone's bottom line in terms of, further management of the forests. Will that be adopted more widely by other governments, do you think? Will regulations just become tighter and tighter?
Absolutely. And if I pan out a second into just business in general, the bulk of any regulatory frameworks for the world of sustainability, they're coming out of the EU, and governments are around the world are sort of falling into line with that. So the EU absolutely is leading the increased regulation. Some people would say it's a benefit, some people would say it's a net negative, but that's to be determined. But overall, things are happening, and governments are absolutely falling into line with that, regardless of the industry. So at this stage of the game, what the EU says in terms of regulation absolutely goes globally.
Yeah, I think there was an interesting talk from, so in the UK, we have something called Impress that runs, it's like a book rep company for about 70 indie publishers. And we had Canongate come on and talk about B certification because they're the first publishing company in the UK to become a B cert. And it costs quite a bit of money. And someone said to them at the end of the talk, so what have you got out of it? Sort of financially, has it, done anything? And they were like, well, that wasn't the point. And I thought, oh, that's interesting, isn't it? Because it's interesting when we look at, will businesses be happy about sustainable changes, or will it, does it actually mean those businesses have to close? But is that a necessity of the world we're heading into? I don't have straight answers for these things, but obviously you can see the scales on both sides. The lovely Jerry says she's curious to how small presses are working with local or international printers to better manage their print runs, and whether POD places any part in this. So that might be, you might have seen some, John, but also some of the publishers on the talk today might have examples. Sorry, Jersey, I'm blind. Have answers to this as well. I mean, on my side, POD for me internationally just makes sense because we don't have international warehouses. We'd have to do international print runs, and that would be currently a little bit messy for us. So we do print on demand for that. And then we have a local printer and a local warehouse that, can ship internationally, but I tend to find retailers were happy to print on demand in that country and get into the bookshop that way. And I don't know what you have seen model-wise people doing, John.
Yeah, POD has sort of changed the game in a lot of ways when it comes to building a more sustainable publishing industry writ large. So I think it's really great. If I think about my own experience, for example, and the POD that's used after a first run of a book, I think it's a smarter way of doing business for sure. It's better for the planet, so you're not producing books that just get thrown away. I was reading in the research for this that close to a third of books are just thrown away without anybody ever reading them. So that is obviously highly problematic when it comes to environmentalism, but POD absolutely has changed that. And hopefully in the not too distant future, we'll start to see those stats change in a more positive direction. So a big fan of that. And I would venture to guess that particularly smaller houses are going to be benefiting from innovations like POD to lower the bottom line. Or
Yeah,
operational costs, I suppose. Yeah.
yeah. I think possibly Northodox. I don't know if they're doing entirely POD, but I know that was quite a big strategy at the start for you. Was that right, James? Are you still doing POD?
Yeah, more or less. We are looking into larger print runs, but yeah, for us, it's kind of the only strategy that works internationally.
Yeah. I mean, it's good for the planet, James. So amazing. Cool. If no one has any more questions, that is the end of our fantastic keynote. Hopefully has spurred our brains with lots of energy and interesting ideas to take forward. So thank you so much, John. It was a pleasure to talk to you. I will send around, I think John's going to send around the slides. I'll send around the recording to everyone and hopefully see you over the next 2 days. Thank you so much for coming.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for the invitation. And thank you all for spending a little time together today.
Cheers, John. Have a good evening.